Maybe the decision about what's best for everyone should be left to, well, everyone.
Maybe we should give the dogs a vote as well.
Game of Thrones. A cautionary tale of why you should probably definitely take that 23andMe test. Just to play it safe. That scene stood out to me as I watched the final episode of the series. Those with power laughing at the idea of acknowledging the will of everyday citizens. For some reason, can't quite put my finger on it. Reminding me of the good old US. We're not actually a democracy though. We're a representative democracy. Fancy way of saying that we choose people to carry out what we want them to do. Supposedly. We seem to do this a lot, giving up power to someone or something else with the hopes that they'll just do right by us in the end. To quote a popular phrase, bitch please. Congress, the people we voluntarily choose to represent us, haven't had an approval rating with us higher than 28% since 2009. They've essentially had a see me after class note for at least 10 years running, but our willingness to give up power to others without checking up on them extends well beyond our government. Call me James St. Patrick, because today we're talking power. It's okay if you didn't get that reference. You're probably white. You guys can't get everything. Race joke. So what are we talking about? Giving up a certain amount of control over our lives seems to just be human nature and somewhat necessary for a functional society. But that control over our lives is power. Some of the time, we're not even aware of just how much of that power we're actually giving up. And that's only part of the problem. The other, and perhaps most important part, is that after we give up that power, we tend not to check in to see what's being done with it. We just see the end results and wonder, how the fuck did we get here? Now, who are we talking about? We're specifically talking about institutions. We give power to governments, which turn around and make policies into law and then enforce those laws. Shout out to Schoolhouse Rock, by the way. I rewatched it the other day. Still holds up. We give power to political institutions like think tanks and lobbyists, who we allow to have influence over the policies that become law. Needless to say, we give power to corporations by buying their products and using their services and becoming increasingly important, giving them our personal information. We give power to media institutions by reading their papers and tuning in every morning and night. We give power to community institutions by being members and giving them our time and money, whether it's religious institutions or that really nice book club that Joan keeps sending you emails about that you get to reply to. With all due respect, Joan, fuck your book club. So when did all this happen? Well, this has pretty much always been a part of society, whether you're talking about chiefs, emperors, kings, queens, pharaohs. But for the sake of this conversation, let's focus on the year that meat dresses were in fashion, the year 2010. We'll get back to that a little later, though. The year, not the dress. You get what I mean. Where is all this taking place? Well, this is a pretty common occurrence in human existence overall, but I'm a self-absorbed American, so let's keep this in the US. The next question is why? It turns out that giving up power is at times rational, especially if there's something in it for us. Like, if I gave up a Charizard, I'd expect nothing less than 2 holographics in return. If you got that reference, you're definitely a nerd. Again, the problem is if we give up the power without getting what we want in return, or if we get something we didn't even ask for, like chlamydia. I never had it. It's just a good bit. Let's talk about how these institutions flex those powerful muscles of theirs. After the El Paso and Dayton shootings, a record almost 90% of Americans said that they favored the government expanding background checks to all firearms sales and transfers. And yet there's been precisely zero movement to do anything even close to that on a national level. In 2018, lobbyists spent $3.4 billion on lobbying the government to do its bidding. Can you remember the last time you spent $3.4 billion on anything? I came close at a Red Lobster once. Those biscuits are the work of witchcraft. And then there's the media. Back in 2009, the Washington Post was exposed for potentially selling off access to its journalists, which is awesome since Nearly half of Americans say that it's very or extremely important for them to keep up with the news. There's a saying that goes, the media can't tell you what to think, but they can tell you what to think about. And that's never been more obvious than in this coronavirus era. Whether it's online news sites or nightly news programs or even social media clips, there's a strong chance that you're probably looking for information on COVID-19. Over 80% of Americans own a smartphone, and nearly half still watch cable TV. That kind of reach is clearly a lot of power. If you're looking for how corporations flex those powerful muscles, look no further than frequent Smeagol impersonator, the farmer bro himself, Martin Shkreli. Shkreli's pharmaceutical company bought the rights to a life-saving drug and overnight hiked the price from $13.50 to $750 per pill. The crazy part is he didn't even go to jail for that. He went to jail for securities fraud. You know, priorities. In an even more recent case of fraud, there's Houston megachurch pastor Kirkpatrick Caldwell, who recently pleaded guilty to a massive wire fraud scheme that centered on selling $3.5 million in worthless bonds to the elderly, many of which I'm sure were a part of his congregation. You know, there's nothing more saintly than ripping off old people that look to you for guidance and comfort. Don't worry, I already ordered the bumper sticker. Blah, 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 blah. You get the point. Here's why you should give a fuck. A few years ago, I was chilling with a woman and she asked if I vote. I told her no, and it didn't matter anyways because money ruled politics. Like any other red-blooded American, I had no idea what the fuck I was talking about, but it sounded about right. Needless to say, I think she kind of looked down on me because I didn't vote. Thanks a lot, OkCupid. If I'm being honest, though, I think that's where my curiosity about politics started. There's nothing that motivates you more than humiliating rejection. Flash forward to now, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know that much more about politics than I did back then. But I know enough to know that I was actually 100% right. It is about money. But I also learned that it's also about power. And more specifically, that the two aren't always the same. In 2010, the Supreme Court decision for Citizens United basically cemented both for corporations. It gave them the power to influence our elections with money. I could bore you with details about why it was such an important case, but I think I'll spare us all my legal expertise and just summarize by saying that it essentially made it legal for big money interests to buy our elections. Now, some might say that money in politics and corruption in our government and elections happened well before Citizens United. And you know, they'd be right. But there's a reason why we have the expression icing on the cake. Have you ever tried to eat a cake without frosting? Gross. Whether we as citizens knew it or not, we lost a lot of power in that court decision. This happens often where power is taken from the people and put into the hands of just a few. And oftentimes those few don't want you to worry about what they're doing with it. As it stands in America, power is controlled by those who are organized and focused on keeping it. And we just see the end result and wonder, how did we get here? Well, the hard truth is it either happened on our watch or without us watching or acting at all. Think carefully the next time you have to give up some power, whether it's voting or what you choose to spend your money on, or that news program you tune into nightly on your news network of choice. Just know that if you do have to give up power, that's not where your job ends. It's actually where it begins. Because otherwise you might wake up to realize that, well, your fate isn't yours to control anymore. And that's why you should give a fuck. We'll be back.
You got something to say? Say it. You have nothing intellectual.
I said, fuck you.
Yeah, because you're an intellectual dumbass who watches mainstream media.
You've probably heard everyone and their mother complaining about the news media, including the news media themselves. Pundits will say that X media organization is biased towards Y candidate, so you should listen to them because they're totally not biased. What these attacks are really doing is using fear to communicate to their audience that this TV network or that newspaper has the ability to threaten you and your way of life. And that ability is powerful. The ability to influence what might or might not happen in someone's life is power. And what your favorite brand of news media is conveniently leaving out is that they love this power themselves. I remember taking journalism classes and professors would always tell us that the news media is supposed to be the gatekeeper of information. As members of the media, it will be our jobs to keep false information out and let accurate information in, while also deciding which stories are important for the public to know about and figuring out which ones confuse or deceive the masses. Which at this point, it's starting to sound like the media is a fort with this imaginary aggressive dog and huge gate for protection. Essentially, the media's job was to sift through information and educate the public on what they needed to know. A huge responsibility. It kind of reminds me of this quote.
But you remember this: when you control the mail, you control information.
Except in this case, instead of controlling the mail, you control the media, which happens to be run by people who are tasked with explaining you oftentimes complicated topics, such as economics, when they themselves got a C- in said subject, even with a curve. Regardless, those in the news media are coming from all backgrounds spanning different subjects of expertise and lived experiences, but the public still looks to them without necessarily always knowing their expertise or beliefs to get accurate information to inform themselves on decisions that will impact their daily lives. And that within itself is very powerful. But does the public understand how that power is allowed to manifest? We spoke to Yves Citon, a professor in literature and media at University Paris 8. Here's what he had to say.
In this current world we're living in, I would say the power of the media to broadcast, to send information, and to attract attention to that information, unfortunately, most of that power is based on economics, is based on money, on who can have the means to produce content that will attract people, or who has the means to attract attention by focusing on who's attentive to what. Most of the mass media, most of the media that really counts, they are dependent upon financing. And unfortunately, we live in a marketplace where the media that have the means to influence the elections, to influence the political agenda and so forth, are the media that have the means. And how do they get these means? How do they get this financing? They get it most of the time by selling the audience's attention.
So basically it's us, the public's fault. Well, before I blame us entirely for signing our lives and power away like when you click the accept button on the App Store Terms and Conditions Agreement, it is important to understand that this power transfer to the media didn't happen overnight, as Nick Couldry, a professor of media communications and social theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science, explains.
Well, historically, for a century or more, we've looked as societies to media institutions to tell the stories of how things are. In large, complex societies, everyone only sees the reality right around them. So they need an institution that brings all that together. And media, TV, radio, the press have become those institutions with all their faults, with all their virtues. But what that means is that the agenda of what is important, the agenda of what we think it is that we should be paying attention to at any one time, is massively influenced by the decisions made by media institutions. So does that mean that media shape how we think? Well, I think to some degree it does, because although we all have our own interpretations of what's in the media, we're often critical of what's in the media. It takes a lot of social resources to come up with a different story of what is going on in our shared society to oppose that of the mainstream media. It's a big social struggle. All media, and this is what has always interested me in my work, all media is about a social struggle to fight for particular stories of what is going on, what our reality actually is.
And this is a key point. Since the media determines what narratives count, they get to direct where the public should aim their focus. If they deem a narrative irrelevant or impossible, say universal health care, that in turn will plant ideas into the public's mind that this concept is not a viable one, which plausibly sways public opinion on the topic. That type of power is every politician's, let's just say, dream. Let's leave it at that, dream. Even though the media has the ability to set agendas, the audience does play a role in what agendas get to stick around. Citon does a good job at explaining this.
If we talk about attention economy, then it means that part of the power is on the side of the audience. if we were to stop paying attention to what Mr. Trump says, Mr. Trump would see his power dwindle all of a sudden. Trump lives because we give him the attention that we do. And we do, obviously, because TV screens and newspaper talk about what he says. We could very well say, oh, whenever Trump's open his mouth, we're going to switch up because it's not interesting. Let's look at what he does and not what he says. For me, that's rule number one. So we, as the audience, we do have some power to do it. And I think the first step would be to realize that in an attention economy, part of the power is on the side of the people who watch, the people who seem to be passive.
And with the public continuing to consume mass media, even though a Gallup poll from 2019 says that only 41% of people have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media, we, the public, are essentially allowing for our own voice, our own power, to be manipulated by people we don't even really trust.
It's not like control in the sense of someone literally directing you what to think. It's a little more subtle than that. It's media controlling the agendas, the sort of menu, if you like, from which you choose to start the conversation about what's going on. You can have choice within the menu. You can disagree with aspects of what's on the menu and maybe ask for a change of the menu. What you can't do is completely change the type of menu that's on offer. So it's a more subtle form of power. That means that it is really difficult to develop alternative news narratives, to challenge the media and say, you're not, absolutely not covering that sort of thing. You need to shift your resources to tell a different type of story. And that means that if there is an organization that wants to, over the long term, change agendas, it's a long-term social struggle. It needs resources, it needs community solidarity, and needs a very clear strategy as to how to interrupt current agendas and push or encourage the media to go in different directions. It's a long haul.
It also boils down to whether the media is ready to take a hard look at the way they explain and call out existing power structures, such as those in government, finance, and the healthcare industry. Certain movements on the left, for example, who do exactly just that, haven't necessarily always had the easiest time bringing this to the public's attention, since they are calling for a shift in who gets to participate in power. But awareness does seem to be on the rise.
What I think is really difficult, and always has been, but it's especially difficult now in this age of social media, is to build a positive, constructive agenda for political and social change through the media we have. In this age of social media, in this age where everyone can shout in the room, as it were, to build slowly positive, complicated proposals for social change, such as proposals for major reform of the healthcare system or major changes, increases probably, in the tax system. These are long, complex proposals which take time to build consensus for. And that's not time that you have in the age of instant rebuttal, instant being shouted down in the age of social media. So building positive change is very, very difficult, more difficult than it has ever been.
You should give a fuck, because the power of the media to a certain extent is in your hands. And why would you waste a chance to have some of that glorious power? You have somewhat of a say when it comes to what sort of stories the media should be focusing on, through your viewership, clicks, and shares. Your attention is critical, and so are your concerns. So ask yourself, am I holding those accountable whose job it is to hold others accountable to me? We'll be right back.
Welcome to the part of the show where we don't just talk about you, where we try to have conversations with you. So don't forget to send an email to the email address below if you actually do want to be a part of the conversation. We're willing to have conversations with anybody and everybody who wants to have it. So I am your humble host or co-host, Tunde Ogunfolaju, joined by
Genevieve Montanar, co-host.
And there we go. And we're joined today by Valerie from Portland, Oregon, as well as Scott from Be More MD. That's the only acceptable way to say it. You can't say Baltimore. I just don't trust you if you say Baltimore. It's either Baltimore or Be More. It's one of the two. It's got to be. So thank you guys for joining us today. We definitely appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, in this episode, we've kind of tackled the issue of power, and how it affects people, and we give power up all the time, right? Like even for something as simple as like going to, we're in the middle of this pandemic right now, and so if you are lucky enough to have somebody that you're with, you might send them to the store, right, to go get some stuff. So we're giving power up to that person to hopefully come back with stuff that's like edible, instead of just like 200 Snicker bars, that we're trusting that to them. So we do that with these sort of bigger places where a lot of power is sort of concentrated, like the government, or we trust in the media to report on stories, and then we give power up in the way that we might believe in a particular story that they're reporting, and we're giving that power to them. That's saying, okay, we trust you to do that, to report correctly on certain things. So what are your interactions with those places that a lot of that power is sort of housed, whether it's the government, the media, corporations, etc. Valerie, let's start with you.
Sure. So I actually talk about power quite a bit in my work. I'm a design strategist, and we work with all sorts of foundations and organizations that are trying to make change. And whenever somebody's trying to make change, you automatically think about like all the decisions that come into play. And the traditional way of guiding, say, a corporation through change is like through a lot of top down, the boss tells you what to do and you do it, kind of a way of doing things that's been done for a long time. But recently, with the advent of design thinking and more inclusive and collaborative design, we're really asking a lot more questions about who is actually being affected by these decisions and how can we bring them to the table. So it's something that we're talking about a lot more, and we're seeing ripples of it all over the place, as you said, from government to foundations and all types of business. Foundations is an interesting one because they have a lot of power in terms of the money that they choose to give to smaller nonprofits, and they can really guide a whole sector change just with their dollars. And I feel like a lot of the times they don't totally realize that. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, so like more on a sort of like an individual basis, how do you interact with these sort of bigger places that house power? How does that affect you, like on a just like a day-to-day basis, or can you remember something that you can think of specifically that you deal with on a personal level?
Yeah, I think I mean the honest answer is no, but that's speaking from a place of privilege. I as a white man, I have power without having done anything to earn it. And I think, I benefit from the systems of power, right? The foundations Valerie was referencing, people that look like me, people that have educations, that have grant writers, they're the ones that they're the ones that often get the grants. Governments, the policies, the systems that are in place, they all benefit me. So I'm coming from that place of privilege. I don't really have much interactions with power. I think my job is to find places where I can give up that power or try to redirect the power to other people. So I know that's not exactly the answer. Seems like that's not exactly the answer you're looking for, but I think that's the honest truth, is that I don't much have to think about power in terms of how other people having power impacts me.
I think an interesting way of looking at it too is that you really see the concept of power playing out in all sorts of relationships, including that of the household. So Tunde, as you were asking Scott the question, I was trying to think about like personally where I encountered power and maybe like the earliest experiences of that. And living in a nuclear family where my dad was the only one working and my mom was the homemaker, there were definitely power dynamics at play there that I really didn't realize until later. And even with myself as a child, my dad used to joke that children are meant to be seen and not heard. He was joking, but at the same time, like, it's reflecting just an older concept. And I get really inspired when I see young families now who give their children a lot of voice in how they manage their home.
So you guys spoke a little bit about power dynamics, and I want to pivot to voting. Voting was kind of portrayed as a way of equalizing power, one person, one vote. So I was kind of curious, do you guys feel like voting gives you, the public, a significant amount of power? We can start with Scott first.
Yeah, I do. I think that's one way where where theoretically everybody has a clear voice. Everybody has an equal amount of power in our voting systems. I say theoretically because there are a lot of people don't vote, and there are reasons that people don't vote. Not having trust, believing elected officials are actually going to make the changes people are voting for. So I think voting is incredibly powerful, but I think distrust in the systems in which people vote and vote on haven't really decreased the value or the power of voting, but the fewer people vote, the more concentrated the power is in the hands of the people who do vote. When you look at voting statistics, it's often people who already have the most power that are voting, right?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. This idea that if you already possess power, that it's much easier for you to sort of turn the wheels of power, right? And now I've said power about 8,000 times, so I think that I'm going to refrain from using the word specifically. But it's something that if you have it, it's a very easy thing to manipulate. But when you feel like you either don't have it or that you don't realize that you have it, then it's an entirely different sort of ball game. And I think that's sort of where we're trying to highlight is that we oftentimes don't realize the actual power that we do have. So yeah. With that being said, how do you guys feel about some of these places that actually do harbor, some of this weight when it comes to decisions with our lives? Do you guys feel like anger towards it, or do you feel sort of indifference in terms of it's just a thing to be sort of used for whatever purposes it's supposed to be used for, whether it is the media or whether it is the government or corporations, what have you? What's the general sort of feeling behind that? Valerie, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah. I feel a bit of ambivalence, or not necessarily ambivalence, but a hard time feeling like I have a lot of power in these decisions that are made. And I think in part it has to do with the way that politics are handled right now. I read somewhere recently that like CNN and the news shows that we watch on TV, they're set up quite a bit like sports shows, where you have commentators and analysts who like break down everything that happens. And I think subconsciously that really it leads to this polarization that we're feeling now, and politics that are all about like certain platform issues. And not necessarily, like, there isn't a lot of room for nuance. And I think like the way that our lives are handled and the way that we fit into the system of government and the way that we fit into the systems of being an American and living in America, it's pretty nuanced. And there's a lot of it that I personally don't understand. And I think that's really interesting, especially when it comes to voting on certain issues, because when you read the language like on the bills that you're voting for example, it can be really convoluted. It can leave a lot of people out. I'm confused by it. I think one thing that Oregon has going for it, though, is that we can vote by mail, which I think allows for a lot more access. And it makes it easier for people who are at the margins to be able to have their voice heard. But making that language more approachable would help a long way too.
Yeah, that's a huge thing, in society. Is sort of, and then I think that's why we, in this particular episode, we've highlighted the media so much, is because they're supposed to be sort of like the gatekeepers of information to kind of filter the nonsense and give us the stuff that we actually need. But what happens when the media itself is this, they're giant, corporate sort of apparatus that and you talk, Valerie, about the fact that there's it almost feels like sports when you're watching the CNN sometimes, having, you'll have a panel of people and then they'll go at it and, everybody's there with their popcorn, like, oh, what spicy thing are they going to say? Everyone gets so spicy since it's CNN. But yeah, there's this, there's this idea that, we need to be informed about certain things before we can make, correct decisions. But Scott, how do you feel about that? About having this, having to make a lot of sort of, big decisions and not being fully informed because, on our own, we can only do so much. We can only, look up certain things or do certain things because we're all busy, with our lives. But we depend on places like the media to provide us with certain information and things like that. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think I get frustrated at media. I often get frustrated at media. I think in particular because it's really incumbent upon voters or even people who choose not to vote, for citizens to find trustworthy information. And I think it's important to draw the distinction between types of media, right? I think we often say mainstream media, and we mean all newspapers. We mean CNN and MSNBC and Fox News. And the reality is those, especially cable news versus newspapers, they're entirely different things, right? One's entertainment and one's information. And I think we've made it so it's really hard for people to, for people who don't already have who don't have media literacy skills, to know what's true and what's not true. It's hard for people to make up their own minds. So often we're told to believe certain things. You curate your own Twitter feed. Algorithms curate feeds for us. We choose what we watch, and then we choose to believe that because those are the people we already trust in. But did they earn our trust? And I think that's a big source of frustration for me. I try really hard to stay informed. But it is hard, as you said. There's not a lot of time to really dig into everything. There's a lot of really complex issues that we're trying to that we're struggling through right now. And I mean, I don't know anything about economics, right? The best I can do is figure out, find who's the person that sounds like it's closest to what I think, and then go with that guy. But how do I know? How do I know to trust this guy? I mean, I really don't. The things that I do. There are certain things that I do feel passionately about, that I do know about. That's a lot easier. But there are tons of things that I have no idea about. And so the frustration comes from, there have absolutely been times where I've taken something at face value because I thought the person knew what they were talking about or was telling the truth in terms of media, and repeated something and been called out on that and been totally wrong. And that's frustrating, right? Those people are in a position of power. People are going to believe what they say. And it's really important that they treat that respectfully. And I think oftentimes they don't.
And I have a question about that. Sorry. How do either of you, Valerie or Scott, do you guys have any idea how the media could possibly rebuild trust with their audience? How do you get to the point where you're like, okay, I trust what you're saying?
That's a good question. I like that term that Scott mentioned, media literacy, as a way for consumers of the news to kind of test themselves or challenge what they're reading and what they're understanding. And I think a way that I value getting information and the news that I trust is news that provides good sources. And I was actually just called out on giving some bad news out to somebody yesterday. It had to do with like what natural flavors actually are. And a lot of the listicles that are out there are about kind of shock value. And as I was like reviewing this article that I read, there were no sources in it at all. So I think just being aware of the sources where you're getting your information is a good way to build trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's definitely that being transparent, I think is at least a little bit that's at least somewhat of the way that there can be trust built. But often sometimes what happens is we have this sort of confirmation bias, right? Like it's I know both of you sort of said it, but it's a pretty typical thing for you to read something like, I believe this thing because maybe there's a part of you that wants to believe it for whatever reason that you might have. And so I'm finding that a lot with not just the media, but with all of it, right? Whether you're talking about corporations where, if you buy something from them, you tend not to think, man, who made this and how much did they make this for? What did they get paid to make this? Or whether it be, politicians we might vote for, they might say things that we might agree with. So we ignore all the other crazy shit that they do and say. And so, we do this all the time. And so it's hard to move past our own sort of like faults, so to speak. But I think if we're going to make sort of, true significant progress in terms of taking sort of our own power, and realizing sort of like, how much power we actually have together as citizens, then we have to start there. We have to start sort of understanding that we just have it to begin with. So yeah, unfortunately, we can't have this conversation all day. We would love to, but yeah, people's eyes I think might glaze over after like a half hour talking about this. So so we'll have to leave it there. I wanted to thank Valerie as well as Scott for joining us on this inaugural episode of Why You Should Give a Fuck. Yeah, I appreciate you guys so much. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm honored to be on the show.
Yeah. Yeah, we will be back at a later date and time. You guys stay tuned to what we've got coming next. And with that, we'll leave you. Genevieve, do you want to sign off? If you have a sign off yet?
Not yet, but thank you for watching. And hopefully we'll see you soon.
There you go. That's a great sign off. Yeah, just echoing what she said. We'll see you soon.